Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Kristen, and today I'd like to give you my final thoughts on the August 2024 currently inked pens. The first one is my Esterbrook Estie in a Tortoise. It has a medium nib, and it was inked up with Yozakura Lidate. This pen and ink pairing was surprisingly pleasant. It's actually this one right here. I was mentally prepared for lots of skipping and the unpleasant feel of watery ink because Yozakura inks tend to be quite watery, quite thin, quite difficult to use on certain papers. But none of those experiences actually materialized. It wasn't one of my favorite pairings, but it did write very reliably, and I am fond of the Tortoise finish for this fountain pen. This next pen is the Pelikan M205 in Moonstone with a medium nib. It was inked up with Troublemaker Ink's Butterfly Dream. And here is the writing sample for that one. Things started out well with this pairing, not here, but generally well at the beginning of the month of August. I loved the juicy nib and the rich flow of the green ink with the blue shimmer. Now over time, the ink began to flow more slowly from the nib. It no longer felt glassy smooth, and I had quite a bit of trouble trying to get it to write at the very beginning here. I actually had to flood the feed in order to get it to write properly with this writing sample. There were some instances where the ink actually splashed inside the cap during the beginning of the month. I'm guessing that had to do with the feed being flooded with ink initially, and that gave me the glassy smooth experience and the splatter of ink inside the cap. Now, one of my frustrations with ink in the cap is that I cannot post the cap without first cleaning it or resolving myself to having inky fingers and ink on the barrel at the end of every writing session. The next pairing was my Franklin-Christoph Model 2, the Vanness exclusive with a double broad sig nib. This was inked up with Manuscript Sugar Plum. Although the pen and ink complement each other very well, I really like the combination of these two colors together. I wasn't excited about using this pen and ink pairing. It performed very well in the pen, but I'm just not a fan of the icy, shimmery purple ink. Next is my Montegrappa Elmo Marshmallow finish with an extra fine nib. It's inked up with Sailor Shikiori Yozakura. This is a super extra fine nib, and I really love it. I have always enjoyed writing with the Montegrappa Elmo. This is actually much smaller. By comparison, if you compare these two, I was able to use the actual grid on this sheet, and I was excited to do that. I love the weight of the pen, even though my hand will become quite tired when I use this one for longer writing sessions. I also love this pen and ink pairing, even though there was some evaporation through the cap, making it appear darker at the beginning of this writing session. The Omo is not perfect. There are reasons to complain about it, but I still really enjoy using this pen. This is my Brute Force Design fountain pen in Spalted Maple. It has a medium 21 karat gold sailor nib. It is inked up with KWZ Brown Pink. And this pairing was one of my favorites for the month. This pen has a lovely 21 karat gold sailor nib, and I love Sailor's medium nibs, and it just works in this pen. The ink in this pen is rich and juicy, and it smells good too. The Spalted Maple pen is just amazing. I love everything about this pen now. This is the Esterbrook Estie Oversized Botanical Gardens finish in the gold trim. It has a journaler nib, and it was inked up with Diamine Tinsel. I was not excited to use this pen. I don't like using straightforward red inks, and the shimmer really didn't do anything to trick my brain into believing that I wanted to use this color in my journal. It's not my favorite, but only because I generally don't like red inks. The performance was lovely. The journaler nib once again performed beautifully with a shimmer ink. So if you want a well-behaved shimmery red ink, I'd say go for this one. This is the Sailor Pro Gear Slim, or the Yoseka Homo fountain pen with a medium nib. It's got the champagne gold trim. And I had this one inked up with Diamine Sugar Snap. It was an ink vent ink, just like Diamine Tinsel in the Esterbrook. Both of these have ink vent Diamine Infant inks in them. This pairing matched better in my mind than they did on paper. The green of Sugar Snap is a bit brighter and more saturated than I anticipated. I really wanted to match the olive green of the finials in this fountain pen, but this green is just a little bit brighter than I anticipated. The ink also dried out in the nib, so you'll see it right here. I feel like it has more to do with the shimmer than the performance of the ink itself. So if you were actually to use this without the shimmer, you probably have no issues with this pen. Whenever the ink does flow from the pen, it does beautifully and very reliably. I just would not recommend leaving a shimmer ink inside of a Sailor pen if you're brave enough to put shimmer inside of a Sailor pen in the first place. Here is my Opus 88 Mini in the coffee shop finish. I'll go ahead and close that valve. This is inked up with KWZ Smells Like Coffee. It has a fine nib. This pairing was sensory joy. That's all I can say about this. I don't really enjoy the taste of coffee without tons of sugar and dairy, but I do love the signature fragrance of coffee. So much so that a bottle of this ink actually made its way into my collection this month. It was quite pleasant to use this ink. Not only do I enjoy the scent, but I also love the color of the ink. My only complaint is that I am unable to post the cap securely like I can with my other Opus 88 Mini. So there is no snapping in place with this one. You have to wedge it on you just have to force it to wedge it just a little bit so that it stays put, but it will still come off pretty easily. And it is completely impossible to post when this valve is open. So I find myself writing with it unposted half the time, and the other times it is precariously posted, but only when the valve is closed. Next is my Visconti Homo Sapiens Dark Age. It is inked up with Wearingeul For Whom the Bell Tolls. This has a medium nib, a juicy medium nib. I enjoyed writing with this pen so much that I will mourn the loss when I finally clean out this Visconti. I loved it so much that I decided against getting this juicy medium nib ground to a cursive smooth italic. I can't leave the pen inked up though. There are just so many pens and ink pairings. There are just so many pen and ink pairings that I would love to try out this year, and I would just end up neglecting this one in the meantime. And that would be a shame. So I'll consider re-inking this pen with either the same ink or another one that is just as deep and saturated as For Whom the Bell Tolls sometime in the future. This is my Bonecrusher 7 Studios Velma model in the Nightfall Test 1 finish. It has a fine nib, and it was inked up with Van Dieman's Bioluminescence. Every time I pick up this pen, I take a little trip over to the Bonecrusher 7 Studios website to see if there are any additional resins that I'd like to add to my collection. This pen feels just that good, and it writes just that beautifully. I would love to have more than one of these in my collection. I was first underwhelmed by the steel Yovo nib, but after inking it up with Bioluminescence, it was one of the best writing experiences that I'd had all month. My only issue stems from the fact that I left this pen unused for weeks during the month of August. The San Francisco Pen Show really wrecked my routine, and this pen and ink pairing, along with the Yoseka home pen, they suffered the most. So there was quite a bit of evaporation happening with this pen, and there was nothing but sheen in this writing sample. The very subtle shimmer that can be found in Van Dieman's Bioluminescence was actually nowhere to be found by the end of the month. The next pen is my Santini Libra, or a Santini Italia Libra in the Fifth Avenue finish. It has, or had, a cursive italic nib grind, and I inked it up with the wet pen Western Trillium. I really wished that I had at least written half of this writing sample with the Santini before I got it corrected by Kirk Spear at the San Francisco Pen Show. It would have been really nice to see a before and after in a longer writing sample, but I just couldn't bring myself to use this pen when I so strongly disliked the writing experience. Now it is writing beautifully. The crisp but glassy cursive smooth italic was the perfect nib for the perfectly wet Western Trillium. I really liked this pen and ink pairing. This is my Scribble Feel in the Granilla finish. It has a fine flex nib, and I inked it up with Wearingeul Don Quixote. This pen and ink pairing was one of the most frustrating pairings of the month. Let's ignore those swatches right there. This is the writing sample for Wearingeul Don Quixote in my Scribble Feel. The colors match so very well, but I'm not a fan of the cool toned brown of the pen or the ink. I'm also not a fan of the way the ink flows from the pen. The lines of my letters are very uneven. They're almost erratic in some places whenever I write with it. I've become so frustrated with the pen that I actually arranged an even trade with a friend. So I'm saying goodbye to this Scribo feel and hello to the Mosto with gold trim and an extra fine flex nib. So this one has a fine flex and I'm getting an extra fine flex nib in exchange. After having tested the new pen, I can say that I enjoy the colors of the new to me pen and the performance of that extra fine flex nib more than this one. This is my Sailor 1911 Large, A Pirate's Life with a fine nib, and I inked it up with Colorverse Massive Storm. This pairing only became pleasant for me once I realized that I needed to lighten the pressure while writing with this pen. I didn't realize how heavy-handed I was when it came to this pen until I had the opportunity to use other people's pens and test out nibs as delicate as needlepoint and ultra extra fine at the pen show. Now, after returning from San Francisco, I tried using this pen with a light hand and voila, it was perfection. This is my Visconti Kaleido in Unicorn Galaxy. It has a fine cursive italic nib and it was inked up with Colorverse Ganymede. This is another pairing that needs a super light hand just because the nib is quite responsive for having no flex. I really wasn't very excited to use this pairing just because of the ink color. Now, the interesting thing is that the evaporation that I experienced with this pen actually worked in my favor. I enjoyed the ink color up here, the writing experience once the ink was a bit thicker and darker on the page. And so it lightened slightly down here towards the bottom, but this was like my favorite experience here. So I guess I'll be checking my ink collection for something similar to this in the future. Let's gently move these over so that I can rank them from most to least favorite. So my number one pen and ink pairing experience was the Visconti Homo Sapiens Dark Age with a medium nib. That was just so much fun to use. And next is my Santini Italia Libra Fifth Avenue finish with that cursive smooth italic grind that I got from Kirk Spear. It was one of my least favorites, but it shot up to number 2 just because of the beautiful nib grind that I have on it now. Next is my Brute Force Design Spalted Maple with the Sailor 21 karat gold medium nib. Oh, that was just so nice. I loved writing with it and I love the fragrance of the ink as well. After that one is my Montegrappa Elmo Marshmallow with an extra fine nib. I can't even complain about it, even when there are things to complain about with this pen. And number 5 is Bonecrusher 7 Studios Velma with a fine nib. Even though the ink like really dried out in this pen and made it just basically sheen at this point, it was still a really pleasant experience whenever I wanted to use this pen. Number 6 is Visconti Kaleido. It is a wonderfully reliable fountain pen. I love the nib on this thing. Number 7 is my Esterbrook Estie in Tortoise. It was just a really nice, reliable writing experience, even with a drier Jacobin ink. Number 8 is my Sailor 1911 A Pirate's Life. Once I realized that I needed a light hand, it was always a positive writing experience. Number 9 is the Opus 88 Mini Coffee Shop. I loved the sensory experience with this one. Number 10 is my Franklin-Christoph Model 2. I think it's so low on this list just because of the ink itself, but it performed flawlessly. Number 11 is the Sailor Pro Gear Slim or the Yoseka Home fountain pen. Really nice fountain pen, really lovely medium nib, but I just wasn't really in love with the ink. Number 12 is the Pelikan M205 in Moonstone. I love this ink, Butterfly Dream, but it was just, it felt like it was a mess every time I tried to write with it. Number 13, Esterbrook Estie Oversized with the red ink that I was just not in love with. And number 14 is the Scribo Feel in the Granilla finish because I'm not really a fan of the ink or the pen. All right, so these are my final thoughts for August 2024. Let me know what you think of these pens and what you think of the inks and the writing samples of each one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope you have a great day and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.